The air traffic controller at Ramstein Air Base stared at his radar screen with growing confusion. It was 3:47 hours, and something was moving through German airspace that shouldn't exist. The signature was faint, almost ghost-like, but unmistakably there. A fifth-generation fighter aircraft operating in full stealth mode. No flight plan, no transponder code, no radio contact, just a whisper of electromagnetic disturbance cutting through the dawn sky like a predator stalking prey. He reached for his coffee, reconsidered, and keyed his microphone to alert his supervisor. Within minutes, the entire night crew huddled around his station, watching the Phantom aircraft drift eastward at subsonic speeds before vanishing entirely from their screens. In Brussels, NATO command received the automated alert with bureaucratic indifference until someone noticed the aircraft's origin point. It had appeared directly above Spangdahlem Air Base, a facility that currently housed exactly 0 operational F-35 Lightning II fighters. The duty officer made 3 phone calls. The third one woke up a 2-star general who hadn't slept properly in 6 days. The crisis had started 72 hours earlier when Russian forces launched a coordinated electronic warfare offensive that turned the Polish border into a communications dead zone. NATO's response had been textbook, until it wasn't. Every advanced aircraft they scrambled either turned back with system failures or lost contact entirely. The enemy had deployed something new, something that could reach out and strangle American technology in midair. Pilots reported instruments going haywire, targeting systems failing, even basic navigation becoming impossible. 2 F-22 Raptors had nearly collided over the Baltic Sea when their collision avoidance systems crashed simultaneously. The general, a man named Rothwell who'd flown combat missions in 3 different decades, had finally done something he'd never done before. He'd ordered a complete stand-down of American air operations in the region. The sky belonged to the Russians now, and everyone knew it. Except someone hadn't gotten the message. Or more accurately, someone had gotten the message and decided it was irrelevant. The Phantom F-35 continued its eastward trajectory, now tracked by 6 different NATO installations and 1 very nervous AWACS crew orbiting over Poland. When the aircraft finally broke radio silence, the voice that came through was calm, almost conversational, with the faint drawl of someone who'd grown up somewhere in the American Southwest. Reach 4-1, this is Gravedigger. I'm inbound to the party. Hope you boys save me a dance. The AWACS controller, a young captain from Ohio, stammered through his response. Gravedigger, you are not cleared for this airspace. Identify yourself immediately. There was a pause, long enough that everyone listening wondered if the connection had been lost. Then the voice came back, and this time there was something in it that made experienced pilots sit up straighter. Son, I was flying combat missions when you were still figuring out which end of a bottle to suck on. Gravedigger is weapons hot and continuing mission. Y'all just stay out of my way. General Rothwell listened to the recording 3 times in his makeshift command center, a requisitioned conference room that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. His staff stood around the table in various states of dishevelment, waiting for orders that their commander seemed reluctant to give. Outside the windows, dawn was breaking over the German countryside with the kind of beauty that felt obscene given the circumstances. Rothwell was 58 years old, a man who'd built his career on making hard decisions quickly, but this situation defied every protocol he'd ever learned. Someone was flying an F-35, an aircraft worth $80 million and packed with classified technology, into hostile airspace without authorization, backup, or apparently any concern for their own survival. The voice on the recording bothered him more than he wanted to admit. It was familiar somehow, tugging at memories he couldn't quite access through the fog of exhaustion. His intelligence officer, a Marine colonel named Voss who'd survived Fallujah and a messy divorce with equal stoicism, cleared her throat. Sir, we've run the voice print through the database. You're not going to believe this. She pulled up a personnel file on the laptop, rotating it so Rothwell could see the screen. The photograph showed a woman in her late 50s, silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, wearing the uniform of a chief master sergeant with enough ribbons on her chest to require a second row. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, and they stared at the camera with the kind of level confidence that came from decades of proving herself in rooms full of men who'd underestimated her. Kessler, Miriam J. Voss read aloud. Retired 2019 after 36 years of service. Multiple combat deployments, former test pilot, instructor at Nelly's, and here's the interesting part. She was one of the original developers of the counter-electronic warfare protocols for the F-35 program back in 2008. She paused, letting that information settle. Sir, if anyone could fly through that Russian interference, it would be her. She literally wrote the manual. Rothwell leaned back in his chair, processing this revelation while his exhausted brain tried to make sense of the impossible. She's been retired for 6 years. What the hell is she doing in an F-35 over Poland? Another staffer spoke up, a young Air Force major who looked like he hadn't slept since the crisis began. Sir, we've checked with Spangdahlem. They're reporting one F-35 missing from their maintenance hangar. It was a test platform, undergoing systems upgrades, not even supposed to be flight-capable. He swallowed hard. Security footage shows a base maintenance worker access the hangar at 200 hours using valid credentials. They were inside for 18 minutes before the aircraft was somehow moved to the flight line and took off. The major pulled up grainy security camera footage showing a figure in coveralls and a maintenance cap methodically working their way through the base's security checkpoints with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they belonged there. We think that's her, sir. She's been working as a civilian contractor at Spangdahlem for the past 2 years. Janitorial services. The room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of aircraft engines outside. Rothwell felt something shift in his chest. Anger, admiration, or maybe just the recognition of someone who'd reached the same conclusion he had, but possessed the courage to act on it. For 6 years, Miriam Kessler had pushed brooms and emptied trash cans, a living legend reduced to the status of invisible background personnel. How many young pilots had walked past her without knowing they were in the presence of someone who'd forgotten more about flying than they'd ever learn? How many times had she listened to briefings about problems she knew how to solve, staying silent because nobody thought to ask the janitor's opinion? "Get me everything we have on her service record," Rothwell ordered, his voice cutting through the stunned atmosphere. "And track that aircraft. If she's going where I think she's going, we need to be ready to support her." He didn't add what everyone in the room was thinking. That support might mean nothing more than recovering wreckage and a body. The personnel file on Miriam Kessler read like a highlight reel of military aviation history, assuming that history was written by someone with a dark sense of humor and a talent for survival. Born in Tucson to a schoolteacher mother and a father who'd worked construction until his back gave out, she joined the Air Force in 1983 when women in combat roles were still a controversial concept and female fighter pilots were pure fantasy. She'd started as a crew chief, working on F-4 Phantoms at Luke Air Force Base, her hands learning the language of hydraulics and avionics before her mind fully understood it. Somewhere in those early years, she'd caught the attention of a crusty warrant officer who saw past her gender to the raw aptitude underneath. He'd pushed her toward flight school, and she'd clawed her way through every gate and barrier with a combination of skill, stubbornness, and the kind of focused determination that bordered on obsession. By 1991, she was flying combat missions over Iraq, though the Air Force brass kept female pilots away from the most dangerous assignments through creative interpretation of regulations. Kessler hadn't complained. She'd simply flown every mission assigned with such precision that commanders found themselves requesting her by name. Her call sign, Gravedigger, came from a mission over Basra where she'd single-handedly taken out an entire convoy of Iraqi armor that intelligence had already written off as destroyed. She'd found them hiding in a cemetery, their vehicles camouflaged among the tombs, and her targeting had been so accurate that not a single grave marker was damaged. The mission report had described her flying as surgical, but her wingman told a different story in the debriefing. She'd flown like death itself, cold and inevitable and absolutely certain. The name stuck, and over the years it evolved from dark humor into genuine respect. Her career had taken her through the evolution of American air power, from the legacy platforms of the Cold War through the stealth revolution. She'd been among the first pilots qualified on the F-22 Raptor, and her feedback during the testing phase had resulted in 17 separate design modifications. When the F-35 program began its troubled development cycle, plagued by cost overruns and technical failures, the Air Force had pulled her from a comfortable instructor position and embedded her with the engineering teams. For 3 years, she'd split her time between test flights and technical specifications, translating between the language of pilots and engineers until the aircraft began to function as promised. Her particular specialty had been electronic warfare, understanding how enemy systems would try to kill the F-35 and developing the countermeasures that would keep it alive. She'd written position papers, trained other pilots, and become one of the few people in the world who understood the aircraft systems at both the intuitive and technical levels. Then she turned 58, hit mandatory retirement age for her rank, and disappeared into civilian life with barely a whisper of recognition, beyond the standard ceremony and a shadow box of medals. Voss pulled up another document, this one marked with classification headers that made the junior officers in the room suddenly very interested in their own feat. Sir, there's something else. In 2017, Kessler submitted a proposal to the Joint Chiefs regarding vulnerabilities in NATO's electronic warfare doctrine. She predicted almost exactly what the Russians are doing now, coordinated jamming using quantum-encrypted signals that our standard countermeasures can't touch. The colonel's voice carried a note of bitter irony. The proposal was reviewed by a committee, deemed too theoretical, and filed away. One of the reviewing officers noted in his comments that recommendations from enlisted personnel, no matter how experienced, should be taken with appropriate skepticism. She didn't need to mention that the reviewing officer had gone on to a cushy defense contractor job and was probably sleeping soundly in his suburban Virginia home, while the alliance he'd sworn to protect was falling apart. Rothwell felt his jaw tighten. The military he'd served his entire adult life was a meritocracy in theory, but often a hierarchy of credentials and connections in practice. Kessler had been too senior to ignore but too junior in rank to truly respect, a chief master sergeant in a world where stars and birds made the decisions. Never mind that she'd spent more time in cockpits than most generals spent in staff meetings. The AWACS controller's voice crackled through the command center's speakers, pulling everyone back to the present crisis. Sir, Gravedigger has crossed into contested airspace. Russian fighters are scrambling from Kaliningrad. We're tracking 4 Su-35s moving to intercept. The tactical display updated in real time, showing the blue icon of Kessler's F-35 pushing deeper into the electromagnetic dead zone that had swallowed every other NATO aircraft. The Russian fighters appeared as red chevrons, moving with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from owning the sky. Rothwell's tactical officer, a calm-voiced Air Force lieutenant colonel who'd flown warthogs over Afghanistan, provided running commentary. Gravedigger is maintaining altitude at Angels 25, speed subsonic. She's not evading, sir. It's like she wants them to find her. That assessment sent a chill through the room because everyone present understood its implication. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission or a desperate attempt to break through enemy lines. This was a test, a proof of concept written in jet fuel and risk. Kessler was deliberately drawing the enemy's attention, offering herself as bait to demonstrate something that she apparently valued more than her own survival. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Kessler's voice, calm as someone ordering coffee. Reach 41, be advised I am going active on all systems. If you're recording this, you might want to pay attention. This is going to be educational. There was a brief burst of static, then her voice came back with something that might have been amusement. Also, tell General Rothwell that Miriam Kessler says hello and she's sorry about the unauthorized borrowing of Air Force property. I promised to bring it back with a full tank of gas. The AWACS controller, thoroughly out of his depth, managed a professional response. Gravedigger, we copy. Be advised you have 4 hostile fighters inbound from the northwest, bearing 285, range 30 miles and closing fast. Kessler's response was almost cheerful. Oh, I know exactly where they are, son. I've been tracking them since they took off. Now watch what happens when you actually understand your own aircraft. What happened next would be studied in military academies for the next decade, analyzed frame by frame, and ultimately become the foundation for a complete revision of NATO's electronic warfare doctrine. The Russian Su-35s came in fast and confident, their pilots no doubt expecting another easy kill against a NATO aircraft crippled by their jamming. Their electronic warfare systems lit up the sky with interference, a wall of noise designed to blind American sensors and turn sophisticated fighters into expensive gliders. Every NATO aircraft that had encountered this wall had either turned back or fallen out of the sky when their systems crashed. Kessler flew straight into it like it wasn't there. The AWACS crew watched in disbelief as her F-35 systems remained completely functional, not just operating but actually improving as they adapted to the Russian jamming in real time. On their screens, they could see her radar locking onto the Su-35s with casual precision while the Russian fighters thrashed around like blind predators, their own sensors suddenly worthless. How is she doing that? The AWACS controller asked no one in particular, his professional composure cracking. Voss, standing beside General Rothwell in the command center, pulled up technical specifications on her laptop with shaking hands. The protocols she developed, she said quietly. They're adaptive machine learning algorithms that don't just resist jamming, they use it as fuel. The more interference the enemy throws out, the clearer her picture becomes. It's like she's turning their weapons into her sensors. Rothwell watched the tactical display with the focus of someone witnessing something that would define the rest of his career. The 4 Russian fighters were now scrambling, trying to disengage from an enemy they couldn't see or track. Kessler pursued with methodical patience, not firing, just demonstrating absolute dominance of the electromagnetic spectrum. Her F-35 danced between their formation, getting radar locks that would have been kill shots if she'd chosen to take them, then releasing and moving on to the next target. She was teaching a lesson, and the Russians were learning it in real time. Their technological advantage had just evaporated. Reach 41, Gravedigger, Kessler's voice came through, slightly breathless now from the G-forces of her maneuvering. I have tone on all 4 hostiles. Weapons hold unless they do something stupid. I think they're getting the message. The AWACS controller, now thoroughly invested in her survival, responded with genuine concern. Gravedigger, recommend you egress the area. You've made your point. There was a pause, and when Kessler spoke again, her voice carried decades of suppressed frustration. Son, I've been making my point for 36 years. About time somebody actually listened. The Russian fighters broke off, retreating back toward their own airspace with the kind of haste that suggested their ground controllers were having uncomfortable conversations with superiors. Kessler let them go, her F-35 hanging in the sky like a ghost, completely invisible to their sensors even as it tracked their withdrawal. In the command center, Rothwell realized he'd been holding his breath and forced himself to exhale. Around him, his staff was erupting in spontaneous cheers and exclamations, the kind of release that came from watching impossible things become reality. But the general stayed quiet, his mind already racing ahead to the implications. If Kessler's protocols worked, and they just watched them work, then the entire balance of power in the region had shifted in the span of 15 minutes. More importantly, she'd done it alone, without orders, without backup, using an aircraft she'd essentially stolen because nobody in the chain of command had possessed the imagination or courage to authorize what needed to be done. That thought should have made him angry, should have triggered all his instincts about discipline and hierarchy. Instead, he felt something closer to shame. "Get her on a secure channel," Rothwell ordered, his voice cutting through the celebration. "I want to talk to her directly." It took 3 minutes for the communications technicians to establish the link, routing it through multiple encrypted nodes to ensure the Russians couldn't intercept. When Kessler's voice finally came through, it had lost some of its earlier confidence, replaced by the caution of someone who knew they'd crossed multiple lines and was waiting to face consequences. "General Rothwell, this is Chief Kessler. I understand I'm in a significant amount of trouble, sir." Rothwell leaned close to the microphone, aware that this conversation would probably be recorded and analyzed by people far above his pay grade. "Chief, I have 2 questions. First, can you teach other pilots to do what you just did?" There was no hesitation in her response. "Yes, sir. Given 3 weeks and access to the simulator facilities at Nellie's, I can train an entire squadron. The protocols are already written. They just need pilots who are willing to trust the systems and unlearn some of what they think they know about electronic warfare." Rothwell nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Second question, when you landed this aircraft, which is going to happen in approximately 40 minutes at a location I'm about to provide, are you going to try to run?" The silence stretched long enough that people in the command center started exchanging nervous glances. Then Kessler laughed, a sound with genuine humor in it. "Sir, I'm 58 years old, my knees are shot, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to need help getting out of this cockpit. I'm not running anywhere. Besides, you're going to need me for the after-action briefing." That answer told Rothwell everything he needed to know about her state of mind. She'd made her peace with whatever consequences were coming, done what she believed was necessary, and was now prepared to face the music. He respected that even as he dreaded the political nightmare that was about to engulf them both. "Understood, Chief. Divert to Ramstein. We'll have a reception committee waiting, and I promise it won't involve handcuffs unless some politician somewhere loses their mind." Rothwell out. The next 40 minutes felt like hours as Kessler's F-35 made its way back across Poland and into German airspace. Every radar station tracked her progress, and encrypted channels buzzed with traffic as word spread through the Alliance's command structure. By the time she approached Ramstein's airspace, there were 16 different flag officers demanding updates, 3 separate investigations being launched, and at least one Pentagon spokesman trying to figure out how to explain this to the press without revealing classified capabilities. None of that mattered to the ground crew assembled near Ramstein's main runway, a mix of maintenance personnel, security forces, and curious pilots who'd heard rumors of something extraordinary happening. They watched the sky with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for air shows or historic flights. When the F-35 finally appeared, it came in low and fast, its stealth profile making it nearly invisible until it was directly overhead. Kessler's landing was textbook perfect, the kind of smooth touchdown that came from thousands of hours of experience. As the fighter taxied toward the designated parking area, its canopy still closed, nobody quite knew what to do. Was this a hero's return, or a criminal being brought in for justice? The question answered itself when Kessler finally popped the canopy and began the laborious process of extracting herself from the cockpit. She was wearing a borrowed flight suit that didn't quite fit, her silver hair plastered to her head from the helmet, and her face showed the kind of exhaustion that came from flying 3 hours of high-stress combat maneuvering. 2 crew chiefs rushed forward with a ladder, and she accepted their help climbing down with visible gratitude. Her legs were shaking. Whether from adrenaline, physical strain, or simple age was impossible to tell. When her boots finally touched the tarmac, she straightened up slowly, squared her shoulders, and waited for whatever was coming. General Rothwell arrived in a staff car that barely stopped before he was out and walking toward her with long strides. His face was unreadable, the kind of professional mask that senior officers wore when they weren't sure whether to hand out medals or courts-martial. The assembled personnel fell silent, watching this confrontation between a two-star general and a retired enlisted woman who just rewritten the rules of modern air combat. They stopped about 5 feet apart, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then Rothwell did something that would be photographed, memed, and ultimately become iconic in military circles. He came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. "Chief Master Sergeant Kessler," he said, his voice carrying across the silent flight line, "on behalf of NATO Allied Air Command, thank you for your service, both past and present." Kessler returned the salute with hands that trembled slightly, and those watching closely noticed the tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. She didn't try to hide them or wipe them away, just stood there at attention, a woman who'd spent her entire adult life serving a cause bigger than herself and had finally been seen. When they both dropped their salutes, Rothwell stepped forward and extended his hand. "We have about 700 different regulations you've violated, and I genuinely have no idea what's going to happen to you. But that was the most magnificent piece of flying I've witnessed in 35 years. Kessler took his hand, her grip still strong despite the tremors. "Sir, I knew the protocols would work. I just needed someone to see it. Nobody listens to janitors, but they'll listen to results." The investigation took 3 days, conducted by a team of officers who ranged from openly hostile to quietly admiring. Kessler sat through hours of questioning, explaining her actions with the kind of technical precision that gradually wore down even her harshest critics. Yes, she'd accessed the aircraft without authorization. Yes, she'd violated about 40 different security protocols. Yes, she'd flown into hostile airspace against direct orders that all air operations cease. But she'd also proven beyond any doubt that her electronic warfare protocols worked exactly as she'd promised 6 years ago when they'd been dismissed as too theoretical. The Russian jamming that had paralyzed NATO's air operations was now effectively useless, assuming pilots were properly trained on the updated systems. The tactical advantage the enemy had enjoyed for 72 terrifying hours had vanished because a retired enlisted woman had decided that being right was more important than being obedient. The investigating officers documented everything, took her statement, and compiled a report that would probably be studied in staff colleges for decades. Then they did something unusual. They recommended no charges be filed, citing exceptional circumstances and the critical nature of her demonstration. The decision would ultimately rest with people far above their pay grade, but they'd done what they could. While bureaucracy ground through its processes, Kessler became something unexpected, famous. Not in the public sense, as most of the mission details remained classified, but within military aviation circles, her name spread like wildfire. Pilots who'd been grounded by the Russian jamming wanted to know how she'd beaten it. Maintenance crews shared the security footage of her methodically prepping the stolen F-35, admiring her technical competence. Younger female service members saw in her story a validation of their own struggles against institutional skepticism. The Air Force, caught between multiple conflicting pressures, tried to manage the narrative while figuring out what to actually do with her. Courts-martial seemed both legally justified and politically disastrous. Simply letting her go felt like condoning the unauthorized use of military aircraft. Pulling her back into service violated regulations about mandatory retirement. Every solution created new problems, and the situation sat in uncomfortable limbo while senior leadership tried to find a path forward. Meanwhile, Kessler returned to her quarters on base, no longer the janitor's closet she'd been using but actual officer accommodations, and waited. General Rothwell solved the problem the way good commanders often do, by ignoring regulations that didn't serve the mission and trusting that his superiors would provide top cover. He created a position that didn't officially exist, Special Advisor for Advanced Electronic Warfare Applications, reporting directly to him with broad authority to access aircraft, simulators, and personnel. The position came with no rank, no uniform requirement, and compensation that was essentially whatever Rothwell decided was appropriate. More importantly, it gave Kessler the platform she'd been denied for years, the ability to train pilots on the protocols she'd developed, and to continue refining the systems that kept them alive. The announcement came through official channels with minimal fanfare, buried in a routine update about personnel assignments. Most people missed it entirely, which was exactly the point. Kessler accepted with the same quiet determination she'd brought to everything else, showing up for her first official day in civilian clothes and practical boots, ready to work. The 3 weeks she'd promised Rothwell for training turned into 6 months of intensive work, taking pilots through the theory and practice of her approach to electronic warfare. Some of them struggled with concepts that violated their training and instincts. Others took to it with the kind of enthusiasm that came from finally understanding systems they'd been flying without truly comprehending. The results spoke for themselves. Within 2 months, NATO air operations had resumed with complete effectiveness. Russian jamming attempts that had once paralyzed entire formations now barely registered as minor annoyances. The electromagnetic dead zone over the Polish border became a place where American aircraft operated with impunity, their sensors actually working better in the presence of enemy interference. Russian doctrine, built around denying the West its technological advantages, had to be completely revised. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew who'd shifted it. Kessler moved through this new role with the same quiet competence she'd brought to pushing brooms, teaching pilots and engineers without ego or pretense. She had a talent for explaining complex technical concepts in language that made sense to people who thought in terms of stick-and-rudder flying. More than that, she had credibility. She'd proven her ideas worked by betting her own life on them. When she told a pilot to trust the systems even when every instinct screamed otherwise, they believed her because she'd already walked that terrifying path alone in the dark. The respect she'd earned through that unauthorized flight became the foundation for something more lasting, genuine institutional change in how the Air Force approached electronic warfare. 6 months after her flight, General Rothwell called Kessler into his office for what he described as a routine meeting. She arrived to find the room crowded with senior officers she recognized from news briefings and policy documents, people whose names appeared on organizational charts several levels above her interactions. In the center of it all stood a woman in civilian clothes whose face Kessler had only seen on television, the Secretary of the Air Force, recently appointed and already developing a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions about institutional practices. The room fell silent as Kessler entered, her civilian clothes and lack of rank insignia making her stand out among the uniforms. The secretary stepped forward with an extended hand and a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Ms. Kessler, thank you for coming. I've been looking forward to meeting you." They shook hands, and Kessler fell back on the kind of professional courtesy that had carried her through countless meetings with people who outranked her. "Ma'am, I'm available to answer any questions you have about the protocols or training programs. I have current status reports prepared if that would be helpful." The secretary's smile widened slightly. "Actually, I'm here because we need to discuss your status with the Air Force. The current situation, your advisor position, works well enough, but it's administratively awkward and doesn't reflect the importance of what you've accomplished." She gestured to the assembled officers. "We've been having extensive discussions about how to properly recognize your contributions while also addressing some of the regulatory problems created by your methods." Kessler felt her stomach tight, recognizing the preamble to bad news delivered with diplomatic language. "Ma'am, I understand that my actions created problems. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences." The secretary held up a hand, cutting off what was clearly a prepared statement. "Ms. Kessler, you're not in trouble. Quite the opposite. What you did was technically illegal, operationally brilliant, and strategically essential. Those three things don't usually go together, which is why we've spent 6 months figuring out how to respond. We've finally reached a decision, and I wanted to deliver it personally." She pulled a folder from her briefcase, official Air Force letterhead visible on the documents inside. Effective immediately, you're being recalled to active duty with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. You'll be assigned to the Electronic Warfare Division at Nellis Air Force Base as their senior technical advisor and primary instructor. Your recall is indefinite but will include an exemption from standard retirement age restrictions based on critical need. She paused, letting that information sink in. You'll also be receiving a formal commendation for your actions over Poland, though the specific details will remain classified. Any questions? Kessler stood perfectly still, processing information that seemed to arrive from another reality. Lieutenant Colonel, not just back in the service but commissioned, jumping from the enlisted ranks where she'd spent her entire career to the officer corps with their broader authority and institutional influence. It was unprecedented, probably illegal without special waivers, and absolutely perfect. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm honored. But I need to understand. Is this about recognizing what I did, or is it about controlling what I might do next?" The secretary laughed, a genuine sound of appreciation. "Both, Ms. Kessler, definitely both. You've proven that you're willing to ignore orders when you think you're right, which makes you either dangerous or invaluable depending on perspective. We've decided you're invaluable, but we'd prefer to have you doing that inside the official structure where we can at least pretend to provide oversight." She became more serious. "The real answer is that we need you. The Air Force needs you. Not as a janitor or a civilian contractor, but as what you actually are, one of the most capable pilots and electronic warfare specialists we've ever produced. We wasted 6 years of that talent because we let bureaucracy matter more than capability. I'm trying to fix that mistake." The ceremony was small and private, held in a conference room rather than on a parade ground. General Rothwell administered the oath while the assembled officers watched, and when he handed Kessler the silver oak leaves of her new rank, she accepted them with hands that only shook slightly. Someone produced a camera for official photos, and she stood at attention in her new uniform, the ribbons from her enlisted service transferred over in careful accordance with regulations. She looked different somehow, not younger but more complete, as if a part of her that had been compressed and confined had finally expanded into its proper space. The reception afterward was brief, with the kind of professional congratulations that military people gave when they genuinely respected someone. As the crowd dispersed and officers returned to their endless cycle of meetings, Rothwell pulled Kessler aside. "There's one more thing you should know," he said quietly. "The pilot who called you out over Poland, the AWACS controller, his name is Lieutenant Morrison. He's requested assignment to your training program at Nellis, says he wants to learn from the best." Kessler remembered the young voice stammering through radio protocols, trying to figure out how to handle a situation he'd never trained for. "He did good work up there, stayed professional when things got weird." Rothwell nodded. "He's one of 14 pilots requesting transfer to train under you. We're going to approve all of them." At Nellis Air Force Base, north of Las Vegas in the Nevada desert, Kessler settled into her new role with the focused intensity that had defined her entire career. The Electronic Warfare Division gave her access to simulators, aircraft, and most importantly, minds hungry to learn what she knew. Her classes were technically optional professional development, but attendance quickly became mandatory simply because pilots who took her training gained capabilities that those who didn't could only envy. She taught the theory, the mathematics of electromagnetic propagation, and the computer science behind adaptive algorithms. But mostly she taught the practice, how to read what your instruments were telling you when enemy jamming was making everything lie, how to trust systems that seemed to be failing, how to use the enemy's own weapons against them. She took pilots into simulators and subjected them to scenarios that made the Russian jamming over Poland look gentle, then walked them through the step-by-step process of adapting and overcoming. Some of them panicked the first few times, their instincts screaming at them to eject from aircraft that were actually flying perfectly. Kessler would talk them through it with the kind of calm patience that came from having been terrified herself and learned to function anyway. "Breathe," she'd say over the simulator's comm system. "Your instruments are lying to you, but your aircraft isn't. Trust the systems. Trust yourself." Her reputation grew through mechanisms both official and informal. The Air Force published technical papers crediting her with advances in electronic warfare doctrine, dry academic language that translated to saving lives in contested airspace. Pilots who'd trained under her spoke about her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends, telling stories that grew slightly more impressive with each retelling. The fact that she'd stolen an F-35 became less important than what she'd done with it. The theft transformed through repeated telling into a righteous act of civil disobedience against bureaucratic incompetence. She became Gravedigger Kessler, her call sign taking on mythic status among younger pilots who saw in her story proof that skill and determination could overcome institutional barriers. The Air Force, recognizing good publicity when they stumbled into it, quietly encouraged this narrative while maintaining official disapproval of unauthorized aircraft use. Kessler herself stayed focused on the work, treating her sudden prominence with the same practical disregard she'd brought to being a janitor. She had a job to do, students to train, and protocols to refine. The rest was just noise. On the one-year anniversary of her flight over Poland, General Rothwell organized a small gathering at Nellie's for the pilots who completed Kessler's training program. It wasn't an official ceremony, just colleagues sharing drinks and stories in an officers' club that had witnessed generations of similar gatherings. Kessler arrived late, coming straight from the simulator bay where she'd been working with a pilot struggling with advanced concepts. She looked tired but satisfied, her uniform bearing the signs of a long day's work. The room fell silent when she entered, dozens of conversations stopping mid-sentence. Then Lieutenant Morrison, the young AWACS controller who'd been her first voice contact during the crisis, started clapping. Others joined immediately, the applause building until everyone in the room was standing, recognizing not just what she'd done but what she represented. Proof that competence mattered more than rank, that being right sometimes meant being insubordinate, and that the military they served could still surprise itself by choosing capability over credentials. Kessler stood in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, then smiled and waved them back to their conversations. "Y'all are embarrassing me," she called out. "Besides, you're the ones doing the actual work now. I just showed you where the light switches were." The conversation that night ranged across topics both serious and mundane, the kind of honest exchange that happened when people who'd shared significant experiences gathered without outside scrutiny. Pilots traded stories about missions where Kessler's protocols had saved them, describing situations where enemy jamming had been so intense that their instruments showed nothing but chaos until the adaptive systems kicked in and suddenly everything made sense. Others talked about the simulator sessions, admitting to panic and breakthrough moments in equal measure. Someone asked Kessler why she'd risked everything on that unauthorized flight when she could have just submitted another report through proper channels. She considered the question while nursing a beer that she hadn't actually drunk much of. "Because reports get filed and forgotten," she said finally. "I wrote that report 6 years ago, and it sat in someone's inbox until it got moved to someone else's inbox. Meanwhile, Russian capabilities were advancing and our doctrine was staying still. Eventually, you realize that being right on paper doesn't matter if nobody reads the paper." She paused, then added quietly, "And because I was tired of being invisible. 36 years of service, and toward the end, people looked right through me like I wasn't there. I wanted to matter one more time, even if it meant getting court-martialed. Sometimes your own pride is worth more than playing it safe." General Rothwell, who'd been listening from the edge of the conversation, spoke up with the kind of candor that came after enough alcohol to be honest but not enough to be stupid. "The Air Force failed you, Miriam. We took one of our most capable people and decided she'd reached her ceiling based on regulations that had nothing to do with talent. Then we wondered why we kept getting surprised by problems you'd already identified. He looked around the room at the assembled pilots. Every person here is better at their job because of what she taught them. That should have been happening for the past 6 years, but we were too invested in our own hierarchies to see what we had. It was the kind of admission that senior officers rarely made, acknowledging institutional failure in front of subordinates. The room appreciated the honesty even as people felt uncomfortable with it. Kessler raised her beer in a small salute. "Sir, with respect, I didn't do this to shame anyone. I did it because the mission mattered and I had the capability to help. Everything else is just politics and hurt feelings." She smiled slightly. "Though I appreciate you not having me arrested, that showed real character." The laughter that followed broke the tension, and conversations resumed their natural flow. As the evening wore on and people gradually filtered out to their quarters or homes, Kessler found herself alone with Rothwell on a balcony overlooking the flight line. Below them, the lights of Nellie spread across the desert, aircraft parked in neat rows and the distant sound of engines on the test ranges. It was a view she'd seen hundreds of times, but tonight it felt different, more significant somehow. "You ever regret it?" Rothwell asked, not needing to specify what it meant. Kessler thought about the question seriously, running through memories of the flight, the investigation, and the strange journey from janitor to lieutenant colonel. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that I had to break the rules to prove I was right, but the actual flying, the mission, no, sir. That was the purest thing I've done in years. Just me, the aircraft, and a problem that needed solving." She turned to look at him directly. "You know what's funny? When I was a janitor, pilots would talk around me like I wasn't there. They'd discuss tactics and problems, never thinking that the person emptying their trash might have insights worth hearing. Now that I have rank and a title, suddenly my opinions matter. Nothing about my knowledge changed, just the frame around it." Rothwell nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her observation. The institution protects itself by establishing hierarchies. Sometimes those hierarchies serve the mission. Sometimes they just serve themselves. He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "I've been thinking about recommending changes to how we identify and retain expertise. Maybe mandatory technical consultations with senior enlisted personnel before major doctrine decisions. Maybe alternative career paths that value capability over rank progression. The details need work, but the principle is clear. We can't keep wasting talent just because it doesn't fit neat organizational boxes." Kessler smiled. "That's ambitious, sir. You'll have a fight on your hands from people who like the current system." "Probably," Rothwell agreed. "But I'll have one hell of a case study to point to when they argue that it can't work. A retired chief master sergeant who became a lieutenant colonel after stealing an F-35 and single-handedly shifting the balance of power in Eastern Europe. That's going to be hard to dismiss as an isolated incident." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the desert night and thinking about futures that were now possible. 2 years after her unauthorized flight, Lieutenant Colonel Miriam Kessler received orders to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the current state of American electronic warfare capabilities. It was the kind of summons that made even senior officers nervous, a direct interaction with the military's highest leadership in a room where careers were made or destroyed. She prepared with her characteristic thoroughness, assembling data and creating presentations that explained complex technical topics in language accessible to people whose expertise lay in strategy rather than engineering. The night before the briefing, she called her elderly father in Tucson, a weekly ritual they'd maintained despite deployments and obligations. He was 89 now, his construction worker's hands twisted with arthritis, but his mind remained sharp. "You nervous?" he asked, cutting through her attempt at casual conversation. Kessler laughed. "Terrified. These are the people who decide the future of the entire military. One bad briefing and everything I've been working on could be shelved." Her father made the dismissive sound he'd been making her entire life when she underestimated herself. "Miri, you stole a fighter jet and beat the Russians single-handed. You really think some generals in a conference room are scarier than that?" The briefing took place in the Pentagon, in a secure room that had witnessed decades of crucial decisions. The Joint Chiefs filed in with their aides and assistants, men and women whose uniforms carried more stars than some constellations. Kessler stood at attention as they entered, her lieutenant colonel rank feeling simultaneously significant and insignificant in such company. The chairman, an army general whose reputation for directness was legendary, settled into his seat and looked at her with the kind of assessing gaze that had probably evaluated thousands of officers. Lieutenant Colonel Kessler, we've read your reports and heard quite a bit about you through various channels. We're here to understand whether your electronic warfare protocols represent a tactical advantage or a strategic revolution. It was the kind of question that demanded honesty rather than optimism. Kessler clicked to her first slide, showing the electromagnetic spectrum analysis from her Poland flight. Sir, I believe they represent both. Tactically, they give individual pilots capabilities that our adversaries can't match. Strategically, they invalidate a decade of Russian and Chinese investment in jamming technology. She walked them through the technical details without dumbing them down, respecting their intelligence while making complex topics accessible. The chiefs asked hard questions, challenging assumptions and probing for weaknesses. They wanted to know about scalability. Could this work across the entire fleet or just with specially trained pilots? They questioned sustainability. What happened when adversaries adapted to the new protocols? They worried about dependency. Were they creating a single point of failure by relying on one person's expertise? Kessler answered each question with data and operational examples, drawing on 2 years of training pilots and refining systems. Yes, it scaled. She'd already trained over 300 pilots with a 97% success rate. Yes, adversaries would adapt, but the adaptive nature of the protocols meant American systems would evolve faster than enemy countermeasures. And no, this wasn't dependent on her personally. She documented everything and trained instructors who were now training others. The knowledge had been institutionalized, made permanent regardless of her individual presence. The chairman absorbed this information with the kind of focused intensity that came from decades of strategic thinking. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and exchanged glances with the other chiefs. Some signal passed between them, the kind of non-verbal communication that came from working together at the highest levels. Lieutenant Colonel, the chairman said carefully, your briefing has been impressive. The operational results speak for themselves and the strategic implications are significant. He paused, and Kessler recognized the prelude to a difficult statement. However, we need to address the circumstances that led to these developments. You took unauthorized action that, while ultimately beneficial, violated multiple regulations and could have resulted in the loss of an extremely expensive aircraft. We have to consider what precedent that sets. The room felt suddenly colder, the triumph of her technical success threatened by the bureaucratic reality of her methods. Kessler kept her expression neutral, falling back on decades of experience receiving criticism from superiors. Sir, I understand that concern. My actions were deliberate violations of protocol undertaken, because I believe the tactical situation required immediate demonstration of capabilities that had been previously dismissed. I accept full responsibility for those decisions. The chairman nodded slowly. I'm aware of your previous attempts to advance these protocols through proper channels. I've read the 2017 report that was filed away as too theoretical. I've also read the evaluation that dismissed your recommendations based on your enlisted status. His voice hardened slightly. That evaluation was wrong, and the officer who wrote it demonstrated exactly the kind of credentialism that weakens this institution. The Air Force Chief of Staff, a woman who'd come up through the fighter community and carried her own reputation for pushing against institutional resistance, spoke up for the first time. The question we face is how to acknowledge that Lieutenant Colonel Kessler's actions, while technically improper, were strategically essential. We can't encourage people to steal aircraft whenever they disagree with orders, but we also can't punish innovation that saves lives and advances national security. She looked directly at Kessler. We've decided on a compromise. You'll receive a formal reprimand in your personnel file for unauthorized use of Air Force property. It will remain classified but serve as official documentation that this institution does not condone such actions. She paused, then continued with something that might have been a smile. You'll also receive the Legion of Merit for your contributions to electronic warfare doctrine and the lives saved through your training programs. The citation will be carefully worded to emphasize the training rather than the unauthorized flight, but everyone who matters will understand what it really means. Kessler felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. A reprimand and a medal, punishment and recognition, woven together in the kind of bureaucratic compromise that let the institution save face while honoring capability. The briefing concluded with a discussion of future programs and funding allocations, the kind of practical talk that followed once strategic decisions were made. As the chiefs filed out, several stopped to shake Kessler's hand or offer private words of encouragement. The chairman was last, and he motioned for her to walk with him into the hallway where they could talk without aides listening. "Off the record," he said quietly, "what you did took more courage than most combat missions I could name. You bet your career and freedom on being right, and you were. The military needs more people willing to do that." He studied her face, reading whatever he found there. "But I meant what I said about precedent. We can't have people stealing aircraft every time they think they know better than their commanders. So I'm asking you directly, if you'd been wrong, if those protocols hadn't worked and you'd been shot down over Poland, would you still think your actions were justified?" It was the kind of question that demanded truth rather than diplomacy. Kessler considered it seriously, remembering the moment when she'd climbed into that F-35's cockpit knowing she might not come back. "Sir, if I'd been wrong, I would have deserved everything that happened to me, court-martial, prison, whatever. But I wasn't wrong, and people are alive now who would be dead if I'd kept pushing papers through channels that weren't listening. Sometimes the mission matters more than the career." The chairman nodded as if that answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "That's what I thought you'd say. For what it's worth, I agree. Just try to exhaust proper channels before you steal any more aircraft." His expression suggested he was partly joking and partly completely serious. Kessler managed a small smile. "Sir, if I ever find myself in a situation where stealing an aircraft seems like the best available option, I promise I'll send you a very apologetic email afterward." That got an actual laugh from the chairman, a brief moment of genuine humor between two professionals who understood the weight of command decisions. He clapped her shoulder once, the kind of gesture that conveyed respect between warriors, and walked away to his next meeting. Kessler stood alone in the Pentagon corridor, letting the reality of the past hour settle over her. She'd briefed the Joint Chiefs, defended her actions, and walked out with both a reprimand and a medal waiting in her future. It felt appropriate somehow, recognition that good outcomes didn't erase questionable methods, but that results still mattered more than perfect adherence to protocol. 5 years after her flight over Poland, Lieutenant Colonel Kessler stood in a simulator bay at Nelly's, watching a young pilot work through an advanced electronic warfare scenario. The pilot was struggling, her instruments lying to her while enemy jamming made the virtual sky a place of confusion and threat. Through the control room glass, Kessler could see the physical signs of stress: white knuckles on the stick, rigid posture, breathing that was too fast. The instructor running the scenario glanced at Kessler, a silent question about whether to ease up. Kessler shook her head and keyed her microphone. "Captain Reeves, this is Gravedigger. Talk to me about what you're seeing." The pilot